The Kākāpō, once considered functionally extinct, is now expected to have its biggest breeding season on record, with all 84 breeding females in the population expected to lay eggs.
New Zealand moved the last 51 Kākāpōs to a remote island, and what happened 31 years later stunned conservationists around the world. At the time, the future of the Kākāpō looked hopeless. With only 51 birds left, extinction seemed almost certain. These rare, flightless parrots were disappearing fast, and many feared they would never recover. But after New Zealand moved the last 51 Kākāpōs to predator-free remote islands, an incredible transformation began. Year after year, scientists watched closely as the birds fought for survival. What started as a desperate rescue mission slowly turned into one of the greatest wildlife comeback stories ever recorded. So how did moving the last 51 Kākāpōs to a remote island lead to something so incredible 31 years later? Join us to find out. Only 51 Kākāpōs remained. Extinction seemed certain. 31 years after New Zealand moved the last 51 known Kākāpōs to remote predator-free islands, something extraordinary happened. A bird that once stood on the very edge of extinction had not only survived, it had fought its way back. The tiny population that conservationists feared would disappear forever had grown into a thriving community of birds. What had once seemed like a desperate rescue mission became one of the greatest wildlife recovery stories the world has ever seen. Today, the Kākāpō stands as a symbol of hope. Its future is still carefully protected, but the species is no longer hanging by a thread. Looking at the numbers now, it can be hard to understand just how close this remarkable bird came to vanishing from Earth forever. The story becomes even more astonishing when we remember where it began. There was a time when the Kākāpō lived across much of New Zealand. Long before cities, roads, and farms appeared, these unusual parrots moved through forests that stretched for miles. They lived in a world that seemed perfectly designed for them. Unlike most parrots, they did not fly. They spent their days hidden among plants and became active after sunset. Their strong legs helped them walk long distances, climb trees, and explore the forest floor with surprising confidence. For thousands of years, this way of life worked perfectly. The reason was simple. New Zealand had very few land predators. The Kākāpō evolved in a place where it did not need to fear many of the dangers that birds in other parts of the world faced every day. Instead of flying away from threats, it relied on staying still and blending into its surroundings. Its green feathers helped it disappear among leaves and moss. In its ancient home, that strategy was enough. But the world around the Kākāpō would eventually change faster than it could adapt. As people arrived in New Zealand, they brought animals that had never existed there before. Rats, cats, stoats, and other predators entered forests that had once been safe. To these new hunters, the Kākāpō was easy prey. It could not fly away. It often froze when danger approached. Nests became vulnerable. Eggs disappeared. Chicks rarely had a chance to grow up. Year after year, the population shrank. The decline happened so gradually at first that few people realized how serious the situation had become. But as decades passed, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Forests that once echoed with the sounds of Kākāpō activity grew quieter. Areas where the birds had lived for generations suddenly had none left. Scientists and conservationists began searching desperately for survivors. What they found was deeply worrying. Small groups remained, but their numbers were dangerously low. Every loss mattered. Every bird became precious. The Kākāpō was not just another endangered animal. It was unlike any other parrot on Earth. It was the world's only flightless parrot. It was one of the heaviest parrots ever known. It lived mostly at night and followed a breeding system unlike that of most birds. Losing it would mean losing millions of years of unique evolution. As researchers studied the remaining population, an uncomfortable truth became clear. Nature alone could no longer save the species. The threats surrounding the birds were too great. If people did nothing, extinction was becoming increasingly likely. What made the situation even more alarming was how slowly Kākāpōs reproduced. Unlike many birds that breed every year, Kākāpōs often wait for special environmental conditions before nesting. Some years passed with very little breeding activity at all. When populations are healthy, that strategy can work. But when only a handful of birds remain, every missed breeding season becomes a serious problem. The species was running out of time. Conservation teams realized they were facing a race against extinction itself. They could either watch the numbers continue to fall or attempt something bold that had never been done on this scale before. Success was far from guaranteed. Failure could mean losing the last remaining birds forever. Yet doing nothing seemed even more dangerous. The challenge ahead was enormous. The remaining Kākāpōs were scattered in difficult locations. Every bird would need to be found, protected, monitored, and moved with extreme care. One mistake could have devastating consequences, but conservationists understood that extraordinary situations often require extraordinary decisions. What makes this story so powerful is that nobody involved knew how it would end. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on the success, but at that moment, there were no guarantees, no promises, and no certainty that the birds could be saved. There was only hope, determination, and a willingness to take risks for a species that could not save itself. The future of the Kākāpō rested in the hands of a small group of people preparing to attempt one of the most ambitious wildlife rescue operations New Zealand had ever seen. And the next step would change everything. To give the species a fighting chance, conservationists would make a daring decision. They would move the last surviving Kākāpōs away from danger and place them on remote islands where predators could not follow. It was a gamble that would shape the future of the species and perhaps decide whether the Kākāpō lived or disappeared forever. New Zealand's risky plan to save a species. By the time conservationists reached this point, they understood that protecting the Kākāpō where it already lived was no longer enough. The birds had survived for thousands of years on their own, but the world around them had changed too much. Predators were spreading through forests, breeding success remained low, and the population was dangerously small. If nothing changed, the species could disappear forever. The solution that began to take shape was both bold and frightening. Experts believed the best chance of saving the Kākāpō was to move every surviving bird to islands that had been cleared of predators. These islands were isolated from the mainland and carefully protected. Cats, rats, stoats, and other dangerous animals were absent there. For the first time in generations, the birds could live in an environment that closely resembled the safe world in which they had originally evolved. The idea sounded simple on paper. In reality, it was an enormous challenge. The first task was finding the remaining birds. Kākāpōs are naturally difficult to locate. They spend much of their time hidden among thick vegetation and are active mostly at night. Conservation teams spent countless hours searching forests, tracking signs, listening for calls, and following clues that could lead them to the last survivors. Every discovery felt important. Each bird represented a significant part of the species' future. Losing even one could affect the survival of the entire population. Teams handled the birds with extraordinary care, carrying out health checks and recording important information before any move took place. Scientists wanted to understand the condition of every individual because the population had become so small that every detail mattered. As more birds were located, preparations for relocation intensified. Transporting a rare flightless parrot was nothing like moving ordinary wildlife. The birds had to be moved safely over long distances without causing unnecessary stress. Conservation workers carefully placed them into specially designed carriers and transported them by boat, helicopter, and other means to reach the remote islands that would become their new homes. For many of the birds, it was the biggest journey of their lives. Among the most important sanctuaries was Wenuahu, also known as Codfish Island. Located off the coast of New Zealand, the island offered something that had become increasingly rare elsewhere: safety. Its forests provided food, shelter, and nesting areas without the constant threat of introduced predators. Other predator-free islands also became part of the recovery effort. Together, these protected locations formed a network of safe havens where the remaining Kākāpōs could live under close supervision. Even after the birds arrived, the work was far from over. Conservationists could not simply release them and walk away. The population was too fragile for that. Instead, each bird became part of one of the most carefully monitored conservation programs in the world. Researchers tracked movements, observed behavior, recorded health conditions, and gathered information that could help improve survival rates. Many birds were given names and individual identification numbers. Scientists learned their personalities, habits, and breeding histories. Over time, the team became familiar with each bird as an individual rather than just a number in a population count. This level of attention was necessary because every life mattered. Still, uncertainty hung over the entire project. Moving the birds removed many dangers, but it did not automatically solve every problem. The population remained extremely small. Genetic diversity was limited. Breeding rates were still unpredictable. A disease outbreak, poor breeding season, or unexpected disaster could erase years of progress. Nobody knew whether the relocation would truly work. There were moments when optimism mixed with fear. Conservationists had created the safest environment possible, yet the future remained uncertain. The species had been pushed so close to extinction that recovery would require more than protection alone. It would need successful breeding, healthy chicks, and years of steady population growth. The challenge became even clearer as scientists examined the numbers. Despite all the effort, the population was still critically low. Every breeding season carried enormous importance. Every egg mattered. Every chick represented another chance for the species to survive. As the years passed, researchers watched carefully for signs that the strategy was working. Some encouraging developments appeared, but progress was often slow. Conservation is rarely a straight path. Small victories were followed by setbacks. Hope rose and fell with each breeding season. Yet one thing had changed forever. The Kākāpō now had a fighting chance. The islands had bought precious time. Instead of disappearing immediately, the species could continue its struggle for survival. But simply keeping the birds alive would not be enough. If the population was ever going to recover, scientists needed to solve another difficult problem: how to help one of the world's rarest parrots reproduce successfully in greater numbers. And that challenge would lead conservationists into a new phase of the rescue mission, one that required patience, innovation, and an extraordinary commitment to every single bird. Life on the island. When the last surviving Kākāpōs finally arrived on their new island homes, there was a sense of relief among conservationists. For the first time in many years, the birds were living in places where cats, rats, stoats, and other deadly predators could not reach them. The constant danger that had pushed the species toward extinction had been removed, but safety alone could not guarantee survival. The islands gave the Kākāpō a second chance, yet the future of the species remained uncertain. The population was still incredibly small, and every bird carried a huge responsibility. The survival of an entire species now depended on the health, behavior, and breeding success of a few dozen individuals. As the birds settled into their new surroundings, conservation teams watched closely. The forests on the islands were rich with native plants, providing food and shelter, much like the habitats where Kākāpōs had once thrived. During the day, the birds rested quietly among thick vegetation. At night, they emerged to explore, climb, feed, and reclaim a way of life that had become increasingly difficult in predator-filled forests. Many of the birds appeared to adapt well. For the first time in generations, they could move through their environment without constantly facing threats from introduced predators. Chicks no longer faced the same immediate dangers that had devastated earlier populations. Nests were safer, and adult birds could focus more on feeding and breeding rather than survival. Even so, conservationists quickly realized that creating a safe home was only the beginning. The Kākāpō remained one of the most unusual and challenging birds to conserve. Unlike many species that reproduce regularly, Kākāpōs follow a very different pattern. Their breeding is closely linked to the availability of certain forest fruits, especially those produced during special years when food becomes abundant. This meant that breeding seasons did not happen reliably every year. Sometimes conservationists waited years for ideal conditions to return. During those waiting periods, progress could feel painfully slow. The population remained small, and every missed opportunity increased the pressure on future breeding seasons. The situation became even more complicated because many of the surviving birds were already older. With such a limited number of individuals, scientists had little room for error. Every breeding attempt carried enormous importance. To improve the birds' chances, researchers began monitoring them more closely than almost any wild species on Earth. Many Kākāpōs were fitted with radio transmitters, allowing conservation teams to track their movements. Researchers could locate birds quickly, monitor nesting activity, and respond if problems appeared. Instead of waiting for nature to reveal what was happening, they could observe events as they unfolded. The level of care was extraordinary. When females prepared to nest, teams often monitored the sites around the clock. Eggs were checked regularly. Chicks were weighed and examined to ensure they were developing properly. If a young bird became weak or faced difficulties, specialists could step in and provide assistance. This hands-on approach dramatically increased survival chances. Yet, despite all the effort, setbacks continued to occur. Some eggs failed to hatch. Some chicks did not survive. Certain breeding seasons produced disappointing results. Each loss felt significant because the population was still so small. Conservation is often imagined as a series of dramatic victories, but the reality was very different. Progress came slowly, one bird at a time. Every successful hatchling was celebrated. Every healthy chick represented another small step away from extinction. What appeared to the outside world as a simple recovery program was actually a daily battle filled with uncertainty, patience, and careful decision-making. Over time, however, encouraging signs began to appear. Birds were surviving longer. Nesting attempts increased during favorable years. Young Kākāpōs were reaching adulthood. The islands were proving that they could support the species in ways that mainland habitats no longer could. Most importantly, conservationists were learning valuable lessons. Every season provided new information about breeding behavior, health needs, and population management. The more researchers understood about the birds, the better they could protect them. Knowledge became one of the most powerful tools in the recovery effort. Still, a major challenge remained. Even with predator-free islands and intensive monitoring, population growth was not happening fast enough to guarantee long-term success. The species needed more than protection. It needed a way to produce more healthy chicks and increase genetic diversity within the population. The future of the Kākāpō would depend on finding solutions that went beyond traditional conservation methods. Scientists had already accomplished what many thought was impossible by saving the last survivors. Now, they faced an even greater task, helping the species rebuild its numbers before time ran out. That mission would push conservationists toward new scientific techniques, bold experiments, and groundbreaking innovations that would eventually transform the fate of the world's rarest parrot. Scientists tried everything to help them reproduce. As the years passed, one truth became impossible to ignore. The predator-free islands had saved the Kākāpō from immediate extinction, but survival alone was not enough. If the population remained small, the species could still disappear in the future. The birds needed to reproduce successfully, and they needed to do it more often. That was easier said than done. The Kākāpō had evolved over thousands of years in a unique environment, and its breeding habits were unlike those of most birds. It did not reproduce every year. Instead, breeding was linked to special periods when certain native trees produced large amounts of fruit. If those food-rich seasons did not occur, many birds simply would not breed. For conservationists, this created a difficult problem. They could protect the birds from predators. They could monitor their health. They could create safe habitats, but they could not control nature's calendar. Some years brought excitement and hope, while others passed with very little breeding activity at all. With such a tiny population, every lost year felt enormous. Scientists knew they could not rely on luck alone. If they wanted the species to recover, they needed to understand every detail of the Kākāpō's life. What helped birds breed successfully? Why did some nests thrive while others failed? Which individuals carried the most valuable genetic traits? Every question became part of a growing scientific investigation. The recovery program soon became one of the most intensive conservation efforts ever attempted. Researchers collected information on nearly every bird. They tracked movements, recorded breeding behavior, monitored health conditions, and studied family relationships. Over time, they built detailed records that allowed them to make smarter decisions about managing the population. One major concern involved genetic diversity. Because so few birds remained, many were closely related. If future generations inherited too much genetic similarity, health problems could become more common. Scientists wanted to preserve as much genetic variation as possible to give the species a stronger future. To achieve this, they carefully studied family lines and breeding patterns. Instead of simply hoping birds would choose suitable mates, researchers began identifying which pairings could help strengthen the population. This approach allowed them to guide recovery efforts while maintaining valuable genetic diversity. At the same time, technology became an increasingly important ally. Small tracking devices allowed conservationists to know where birds were located and what they were doing. Nest cameras provided a closer look at breeding activity without disturbing the animals. Information that once took weeks to gather could now be collected far more efficiently. These tools revealed important patterns. Scientists learned more about nesting behavior, feeding habits, and chick development than ever before. Each discovery improved their ability to respond when problems arose. Instead of reacting after something went wrong, they could often prevent issues before they became serious. When females laid eggs, monitoring became especially intense. Conservation teams carefully checked nests and observed developing chicks. If a chick appeared weak or underweight, assistance could be provided. Some eggs received special attention to improve their chances of survival. Every successful hatch represented another victory in the fight against extinction. Still, challenges continued. Not every breeding season produced good results. Some eggs failed to hatch. Some chicks struggled despite receiving help. There were moments when progress seemed frustratingly slow. The recovery program celebrated successes, but it also faced disappointments that reminded everyone how fragile the species remained. Yet, the determination of the conservation teams never faded. Rather than accepting setbacks, they searched for new solutions. They analyzed data, tested different approaches, and adapted their methods whenever necessary. The goal was always the same: give every bird the best possible chance to contribute to the future of the species. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when scientists began using artificial insemination to support breeding efforts. This technique helped increase the chances of successful fertilization and allowed valuable genetic traits to be passed on more effectively. For a species with such a limited population, every healthy chick carried enormous importance. Artificial insemination became another tool that could help strengthen the recovery effort. The results gradually began to show. More chicks were surviving. Breeding success improved in several seasons. Researchers gained a deeper understanding of how to support both adult birds and their offspring. The recovery program was becoming more sophisticated with each passing year. What made the achievement remarkable was that it combined science and patience in equal measure. There was no single miracle solution. The recovery was built from thousands of small actions carried out over decades. Every nest monitored, every health check completed, every breeding season studied added another piece to the puzzle. Slowly but steadily, the odds began to shift. For years, conservationists had been fighting simply to prevent extinction. Now, for the first time, they could start imagining something bigger. The population was still vulnerable, but signs of genuine recovery were beginning to emerge. Then came a turning point that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. After decades of careful work, improved management, and scientific innovation, the Kākāpō population was about to experience a breeding success unlike anything conservationists had seen before. What happened next would transform the recovery program and give the species its greatest boost in generations. The baby boom nobody expected. For decades, the recovery of the Kākāpō had moved forward in small, careful steps. Conservationists celebrated every successful hatch, every healthy chick, and every slight increase in population numbers. Progress was real, but it was often slow. After spending years fighting simply to keep the species alive, few people expected what would happen next. Then came a breeding season that changed everything. The conditions in the forests were unusually favorable. Native trees produced large amounts of fruit, creating the perfect environment for breeding. For the Kākāpō, this was an important signal. Females that had waited years for the right conditions suddenly had the resources needed to raise young. Almost immediately, conservation teams noticed a surge in activity. Across the predator-free islands, more birds began showing signs of breeding than researchers had seen in many previous seasons. Nests started appearing in different locations. Eggs were being laid. The recovery team realized they were witnessing something special, but nobody knew just how remarkable the season would become. As weeks passed, excitement continued to build. Conservationists monitored nests day and night. Cameras captured activity that researchers once could only dream of observing. Every update brought fresh hope. Eggs were hatching. Chicks were surviving. The numbers kept growing. The season soon became one of the most successful breeding periods in the history of the recovery program. For people who had spent years worrying about extinction, the sight of so many young birds was almost unbelievable. What made the moment even more powerful was the memory of how close the species had come to disappearing forever. Just a few decades earlier, there had been only 51 known Kākāpōs left in the world. Now, new chicks were arriving in numbers that seemed impossible during those dark years. Still, the work was far from over. Young Kākāpōs require careful attention, especially during the early stages of life. Conservation teams weighed chicks regularly, monitored their growth, and stepped in whenever support was needed. Every bird represented a valuable addition to the population, so researchers worked tirelessly to maximize survival rates. Many chicks responded well. As they grew stronger, optimism spread throughout the conservation community. The recovery effort that had once focused entirely on preventing extinction was now producing a new generation of birds. The population was no longer standing still. It was beginning to grow at a pace rarely seen before. The impact of the baby boom reached far beyond simple numbers. Each surviving chick represented new hope for the future. A larger population meant a stronger chance of preserving genetic diversity. It meant more opportunities for future breeding seasons. It meant the species was becoming more resilient than it had been in decades. For conservationists, the moment felt like proof that years of dedication were finally paying off. The predator-free islands were working. Intensive monitoring was working. Scientific innovations were working. The countless hours spent tracking birds, protecting nests, studying genetics, and improving breeding success were producing visible results. Perhaps most importantly, the recovery story was beginning to inspire people around the world. Many endangered species continue to struggle despite conservation efforts. The Kākāpō showed that even a species pushed to the very edge of extinction could recover when enough commitment, science, and patience were applied over a long period of time. By the end of the season, the population had received one of the biggest boosts in its modern history. The achievement was celebrated not because the battle was over, but because it proved recovery was truly possible. The species still faced challenges, and conservation work would continue for years to come. Yet, something had fundamentally changed. The conversation was no longer about whether the Kākāpō could survive. Now people were beginning to ask how far the recovery could go, and as population numbers continued to climb, the answer became clearer. The bird that once seemed destined for extinction was moving toward one of the most remarkable wildlife comebacks ever recorded. The extraordinary transformation that had become as the population grew from only 51 surviving birds into a conservation success story that captured the attention of the world. 31 years later, something incredible happened. 31 years after conservationists moved the last 51 Kākāpōs to remote predator-free islands, the results were nothing short of extraordinary. The species that once seemed destined for extinction had achieved something very few people thought possible. Instead of disappearing, the population had grown steadily through decades of protection, scientific research, and careful management. What began as a desperate rescue mission had become one of the world's greatest conservation success stories. The numbers told an incredible story. From just 51 known birds in the mid-1990s, the population grew to more than 2 individuals. Every increase represented years of dedication from researchers, rangers, veterinarians, and volunteers who refused to give up on a species that could not protect itself. Yet the success was about far more than numbers. The Kākāpō has become a symbol of what can happen when people act before it is too late. It showed that extinction is not always inevitable. Even when a species appears to be on the brink of disappearing forever, recovery is possible if enough effort, knowledge, and patience are invested over time. Today, the forests of New Zealand's protected islands are home to a growing population of these remarkable parrots. Young birds are being born, new generations are emerging, and the species has been given a future that once seemed impossible. The journey is not over. Conservationists continue to monitor the birds closely, protect their habitats, and manage their genetic diversity. Challenges still exist, and the Kākāpō remains one of the world's rarest parrots. But the outcome remains extraordinary. A bird that stood only a step away from extinction survived against overwhelming odds. From a tiny population of 51 survivors, the Kākāpō fought its way back and reminded the world that sometimes nature's most inspiring stories begin when hope appears to be almost gone. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.